Scott had chased after me for 3 years, sparing no effort. But right after I agreed to be with him, he suddenly turned into a completely different person. He humiliated me, Lauren, in front of everyone. "You're just a useless, illegitimate daughter who does nothing but eat and wait for death," he sneered. "How can you even compare to Sandy's real talent and education? Your family's about to go bankrupt, and I'm not wasting my time on trash like you." He then turned around and looked at Sandy with tender affection in his eyes. That was when I knew Scott had been reborn too. Unfortunately for him, he didn't realize that Sandy's so-called talent and education were actually stolen, and that my family would never go bankrupt. "Lauren, you're just a good-for-nothing, illegitimate daughter. You're nothing compared to Sandy's true abilities. Let's break up," he said coldly. At the celebration party, Scott held Sandy's hand and walked right up to me. There was a flash of something unreadable in his eyes, something I knew all too well. In my previous life, Scott and I had only been married for 2 months when my family suddenly went bankrupt. We didn't even have time to enjoy a few good days before he revealed his true nature. It turned out his 3 years of persistence had nothing to do with love. He had only approached me because he knew I had a wealthy father. Once his plan fell through, he began drinking heavily and abusing me. I couldn't escape in time and was stabbed to death by him in a drunken rage. But with the last ounce of strength I had, I managed to take him down with me. And now, both of us had come back to life. "Lauren, are you mad?" Sandy asked sweetly. "But Scott and I are truly in love. I'm begging you to let us be together." I was lost in my thoughts and didn't respond. Just then, Sandy, who had been leaning gently into Scott's embrace, suddenly stepped forward and took my hand. With a delicate motion, she pretended to wipe away non-existent tears, like she was made of fragile porcelain. "Lauren, I'm the one who wants to break up with you. This has nothing to do with Sandy. Please don't make things hard for him." Before I could react, Scott suddenly pushed me aside and stepped protectively in front of Sandy, glaring at me with hostility. That finally snapped me out of my daze. I looked at Scott, meeting his disgusted gaze directly, and my tone instantly turned cold. "So you came here today to break up with me? You two really couldn't even wait one more day? You're that desperate to cheat?" Being cheated on and humiliated in public, I wasn't going to just stay quiet. No matter what, Scott and I hadn't officially broken up yet. Him showing up at this event with his new lover just to humiliate me? That was crossing the line. Sure enough, the moment I spoke, Scott's face darkened. The first thing he wanted to do after being reborn was to cut ties with me and cling to Sandy. But he forgot that what he was doing now was cheating, at a public celebration banquet, no less. He could forget about having any kind of good reputation from now on. "You've always been cold and emotionally distant, acting like some spoiled rich girl. I've wanted to break up with you for a long time, but you were the one who wouldn't let go," Scott said angrily. "Yeah, I like Sandy, but the two of us are still innocent." Noticing the strange looks from the people around us, Scott forced himself to calm down and started turning the blame on me, while Sandy played the victim and followed his lead. "That's right, Lauren," she chimed in. "Even though we're not officially together yet, we know we've wronged you. It's just that we couldn't help falling in love. Watching Scott suffer every day breaks my heart." The two of them were twisting the story to make it sound like I had always been arrogant and overbearing, abusing my status as his girlfriend to bully Scott, and that he had only fallen in love with Sandy because he couldn't take it anymore. So this was all my fault now? I raised my hands and clapped slowly, mocking them. "Wow, you two actually managed to make cheating sound so pure and elegant. No wonder you feel no shame standing together like this." "Scott, you said I was emotionally abusive. Show me proof. Don't just make things up out of thin air. Fine, let's break up. But first, give me back all the money I transferred to you while we were dating." Scott's desperate deflection reminded me, if we were breaking up, I wanted back everything I'd spent on him. My dad always gave me a generous allowance, and I'd always been the kind to spend freely. Even though we'd only been dating for just over a month, I'd already given him a lot of money under various excuses he came up with. Who doesn't spend money in a relationship? Sandy shot back angrily before Scott could even speak. Scott never asked you for anything. Now you're rushing to ask for money back? That's pathetic. She then exchanged a glance with the girl standing behind her. When I date someone, I never ask for my money back after we break up. After all, I spent it willingly. Who even has the nerve to ask for money back after a breakup? Someone in the crowd scoffed. Yeah, just now I was thinking maybe Scott wasn't technically cheating, but seeing how loaded Lauren is and still being so petty, she must be really hard to get along with. Totally. No wonder, she's an illegitimate child. People like that are always so narrow-minded. As the conversation around us slowly veered off track, I caught a flash of satisfaction in Sandy's eyes. Still, she put on her fake kindness and tried to play mediator. Come on, I was just stating the facts. Everyone, let's not get sidetracked. Sure, Lauren's an illegitimate daughter, but it's not like she chose to be. From the beginning, both Scott and Sandy had been clinging to my status as an illegitimate child, like it was some major shame. But in reality, my parents weren't even married to anyone else, just unmarried with me born out of wedlock. If my mom hadn't been so stubborn, they would have tied the knot ages ago. Sandy thought she had found my weak spot, flaunting her smug little expression, completely missing the way Scott's face was turning black with humiliation. So, Scott, I said casually once the crowd's murmurs died down, you're really not planning to return the 500 grand you borrowed from me under all those fake excuses? Wait, how much? Someone gasped. Did I hear that right? 500,000? And Scott and Lauren were only dating for, what, a month? Damn, my family doesn't even make that much in a year. He must have bled her dry. If he still got the nerve to split up with her, that's insane. The people who had been criticizing me moments ago instantly fell silent. Now everyone's attention was on how I had spent $500,000 on Scott in just over a month. Even Sandy looked at him in disbelief. Scott, did Lauren really give you that much money? It's just $500K, he muttered through gritted teeth, trying to save face. Even if you hadn't said anything, I was going to pay you back. Desperate to salvage his image, Scott begrudgingly agreed to return the money. Watching him grit his teeth, clearly unwilling but forced to go through with it, gave me a rare sense of satisfaction. Well, if you're offering, I won't say no, I said coolly. Don't worry, I keep my word. I expect the bank card by tomorrow. I held out my hand, and the sight of it made Scott's face twist in anger. After throwing out his last bitter words, he yanked Sandy with him and stormed off. Once they were gone, I ignored my classmates' awkward attempts to get on my good side. I didn't care. I walked off alone. Just came back to life and already went through this whole ordeal. I needed time to plan my next steps. Now that I was officially broken up with Scott, the disaster that was our marriage in my past life was finally avoidable. Scott was clearly rushing to cozy up to Sandy, probably because he knew she was about to win the national design competition and become the personal protégé of a famous designer. Her future looked bright. Too bad no one knew her so-called masterpiece was actually stolen from her own sister. Sandy had no real talent, she was just a full-blown plagiarist. Honestly, she and Scott were a perfect match. If I'm right, the reason Sandy got close to Scott so quickly in this life was because she thought he was some rich trust fund kid. In that case, I need to make sure they stay stuck with each other. Sure enough, the next day, Scott showed up with a bank card. Lauren, the full 500 grand is in here. Not a cent missing, he said coldly. I had just reached the bottom of the dorm building when I ran into him. He grabbed me and dragged me to a quiet corner before tossing the bank card at me with a scornful look on his face. I caught it easily and calmly started putting it into my bag. But I saw the unwillingness flash clearly in his eyes. He couldn't help but spit venom one more time. Lauren, you're such a petty, low-class, illegitimate daughter. No wonder your dad's going bankrupt soon. I must have been blind to ever like a lazy bum like you. You're nothing compared to my Sandy. Once she becomes Professor Lee's personal student, you'll be left with nothing, just a broke nobody. He looked visibly smug as he spoke, like being associated with me was his downfall, and being with Sandy would make him rich overnight. But how could he be so naive as to think everything would happen exactly like it did in our last life? I came back to change the ending. I ignored his smugness and fired back with a cold smile. So that's why you ran to Sandy? Hoping to live off her? Gotta say, you really know how to be a freeloader. I should be thanking you for breaking up with me. You saved me from the nausea of pretending to like you. I mercilessly exposed all the thoughts he thought he'd hidden. The look on his face cracked instantly. Shut up, he snapped. And don't look at me like you're better than me. Lauren, you think you're still high and mighty? You've just got some stinking money, Scott hissed. But soon enough, I'll have you crushed under my feet. Enjoy your last few good days while you can. His gaze suddenly turned sinister as he looked at me, lips curling into a smirk. A second later, as if something had just occurred to him, he burst into laughter. My heart skipped a beat. I instinctively wanted to ask what he meant, but before I could speak, Sandy appeared behind him, latching onto his arm with practiced intimacy, flashing me a smug look. Scott, I was just looking for you, she said sweetly. Don't worry. With someone like me by your side, I won't waste my time on garbage. Her submission and dependence clearly pleased Scott. He gently patted her head, gave me a cold glance, then ignored me completely. Sandy looked pleased with herself, puffed up by Scott's open disdain for me. Still playing innocent, she kept her tone sugary while continuing to mock me. Lauren's way more capable than me. Sure, she's an illegitimate child, but her dad's rich. As long as she's shameless enough, she can always get money. Not like me, I have to rely on myself for everything. Even with all this talent, I constantly worry it'll go to waste. She was obviously being sarcastic, acting as if she were praising me while actually insulting me. All the while, she kept sneaking glances at my reaction. She wanted me to explode in anger, to make herself look more soft and innocent by comparison. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Scott, however, gently patted her shoulder and said warmly, Don't worry, Sandy. I'll help you make your dreams come true. A gem like you shouldn't stay hidden. You're amazing, she whispered, looking at him like he was her hero. Watching the two of them flirting in front of me made me physically sick. I couldn't help but snap. If someone truly has talent, they'll succeed. But what I'm afraid of are people who have no skills and resort to stealing others' work to get ahead. What are you talking about? Sandy's expression changed instantly. Her face tightened, and she stared at me with growing suspicion. Scott looked like he wanted to argue, but Sandy instinctively reached out to grab his wrist. I turned away and walked off gracefully. If they were going to ruin my mood, I might as well ruin theirs too. I'd already guessed Scott would play dirty, so I had people watching him closely. Still, I didn't expect him to go this far. Professor, I want to report something, he suddenly shouted. Lauren's graduation project wasn't completed independently. She cheated and isn't qualified to be named outstanding graduate of our department. When the professor had just announced that I'd be giving the speech at our graduation ceremony as the representative outstanding graduate, Scott suddenly stood up from the back row and exposed me in front of everyone. You're lying. I didn't cheat. That project was entirely my own work. My mind stalled for a second, then I instinctively turned and shouted back at him. Right in time to catch his smug, provocative look. Even though I knew the work was my own, the dark gleam in his eyes made me uneasy. Do you have any evidence? One of the professors asked sharply. You shouldn't make accusations without proof. All of us on the faculty have reviewed Lauren's project. It's excellent. But Scott looked confident and unfazed. I do have proof, he said. Professor, I once saw a conversation on Lauren's phone. Her design idea came from a conversation with an online friend. It wasn't her original concept. I was stunned. I hadn't expected Scott to stab me in the back like this. He had snooped through my phone. It was true that the initial inspiration for my project had come from a chat with a stranger online. But I had taken that tiny spark of an idea and built something completely new on top of it. Everything afterward, the research, the sketches, the execution, was entirely my own. There wasn't a single thing about it that could be called plagiarism. Scott only had a screenshot of that early conversation. I let out a breath of relief. For a moment I thought he had something bigger. Our school actually encouraged students to seek creative inspiration from everyday life and even online sources. It was perfectly normal. But what if someone else has already used a similar concept and created a design with it? Scott added maliciously. If I remember correctly, school policy says that any disputed work can't be selected for outstanding graduate honors. So whether or not you plagiarized is irrelevant. You're automatically disqualified. As he spoke, he walked up to the podium with a flash drive and pulled up a file on the projector. On screen appeared a design that looked strikingly similar to mine. Same concept, even eerily similar wording in the descriptions. The moment I saw the username, I knew. I'd been set up by that online friend. I had finished my design a long time ago, and since I had chatted so well with that person back then, I'd foolishly shared my draft with them. I figured my advisor already had a copy, so what harm could it do? But now, looking at the details on the screen, I had to admit, some of those elements were way too similar. Could it be true? Did Lauren really plagiarize? I don't know if it's plagiarism exactly, but there's definitely some copying going on. Copying? Come on, that's outright stealing. Wouldn't be surprised if she paid someone to make it for her. Girls like her, rich heiresses, never have real talent anyway. In just a few minutes, a wave of doubt and whispers swelled around me. Scott listened to our classmates gossiping behind their hands with a face full of smug satisfaction. "Lauren, what's going on?" One of the professors finally asked. "Did you really plagiarize?" Even Mr. Young, the head of our department, was looking at me with suspicion. I clenched my fists so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. No, I had to stay calm and find a way to clear this up. If I let them slap the label of plagiarism on me, I'd never be able to defend myself again. I had an idea. I quickly pulled out my laptop and logged into my NutCloud account. All of my class files were stored there, complete with timestamps. I found my original draft. It was completed during the second semester of junior year. I also found the screenshots of my chat with that online friend. "Professor," I said, raising my voice, "here's the timestamp showing when I completed the first draft. That was over a year ago. I also sent a copy to that online contact at the time. I'm guessing that's when they got the idea, tweaked it, and posted it online later. But as you can see from the dates, I didn't copy anyone. If anything, they copied me." Then I quickly found the original post on Weibo. Sure enough, it had been published several months after I had already completed my draft. It was obvious they had borrowed from my design and simply repackaged it before making it public. "Even if you didn't technically plagiarize," Scott cut in mockingly, "your work clearly lacks originality. You should be disqualified from being named outstanding graduate. Mr. Young, I suggest we let the second-ranking student, Sandy, deliver the graduation speech instead." He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. This wasn't about proving I cheated, it was about stripping me of my award so Sandy could take my place. I finally realized that Scott had never expected this trick to get me kicked out for plagiarism. He just wanted to steal the spotlight and hand it over to Sandy. My expression turned icy. I'd let my guard down, and now I was paying for it. But I had done nothing wrong. I was the victim here. Why should I lose an honor I had earned with my own abilities, just because someone else took advantage of my trust? Even if the outcome didn't look promising, I wasn't going down without a fight. "Why don't we take a look at Sandy's new competition piece?" Scott offered suddenly. "Mr. Young, this is Sandy's latest design, created for the National Design Competition. I think you'll agree, it's clearly on a much higher level than Lauren's graduation project. She's more than qualified to represent our department." Seeing that Mr. Young was still hesitant, Scott pressed harder, motioning for Sandy to present her work. She stepped forward and opened her design portfolio. This is Sandy's work?" Mr. Young's eyes widened. "It's incredible. Pure genius. It's on a level even we teachers can't reach," another professor murmured in amazement. "Sandy, you've been hiding your talent this whole time." To take me down, Scott and Sandy had even pulled out her competition piece. And just as I feared, Mr. Young was completely blown away by it. I knew all too well what this piece meant. It was the same design that would later win Sandy the national prize and land her a spot as the personal disciple of a famous designer. I couldn't compete with that. Back in my previous life, when Sandy suddenly won the competition, I'd also been curious. We had always been on par during school. How did she suddenly evolve overnight? It wasn't until later, through a lucky accident, that I learned the truth. Sandy had stolen the design from her older sister, who studied at one of the top universities in the country. They weren't even in the same league. But Sandy's parents favored her, so they turned a blind eye and let their younger daughter take credit for her sister's work. Mr. Young was still full of praise. "This piece, you designed this yourself?" "Yes," Sandy said demurely. "It took me a long time to create it. I'm honored to receive your praise, Professor." As he continued marveling at the work, she finally exhaled with relief and turned to beam at Scott, though her face remained humbly composed. "Mr. Young, I believe the faculty here values talent and fairness. I trust you'll make the right decision," she said sweetly. "Don't worry," Mr. Young said enthusiastically. "Come with me to the office. I'd like to hear more about your creative process." He was so impressed he could barely hear anything else. With a proud smile, he linked arms with Sandy and led her away. Scott followed right behind, and as he passed me, he scoffed under his breath. My blood was boiling. I clenched my fists so tight they shook. "Scott, Sandy, I'll make you pay for this. Every last bit." That day, Mr. Young kept Sandy in his office for a long time. When she finally walked out, glowing with satisfaction, I knew then my spot as the graduation speaker had really been taken away. So when I got a call from Mr. Young that evening, I wasn't the least bit surprised. Even though I had already proven that I didn't plagiarize, the controversy around my project remained. And besides, Sandy's masterpiece had blown away the entire department. Now, behind the scenes, they were all betting on her to win the national competition. Too bad for them. On the day of the competition, Sandy's plagiarism scandal would be exposed for all to see. That thought alone helped me calm down. So what if they stole the outstanding graduate speech from me? Let them have it. Falling from heaven into hell hurts the most when you think you've already won. For the next 2 weeks, I didn't return to campus. I kept myself busy with my own plans. It wasn't until the day of graduation that I showed up again. Well, Lauren. You've still got the guts to come back?" Scott sneered as soon as he saw me. "If I were you, I'd stay home crying out of embarrassment. Must suck having something that was rightfully yours ripped away." I hadn't even made it to the auditorium before Scott and Sandy blocked my path. His tone was arrogant, smug. Sandy, ever the fake, playfully tapped Scott's chest and pinched her nose like she was teasing. "Oh, Scott, don't say that. Lauren's still pretty capable," she said with faux sympathy. "She just had the bad luck of running into me. Even the professors said it, my kind of talent is genius level. No matter how hard others try, they'll never catch up. Some things are just decided at birth. It's a shame some people don't know their place." The more she talked, the more pleased she seemed with herself. Her eyes sparkled. Clearly, she'd been spoiled by everyone's praise lately. She probably even believed that design was truly her own. I watched her quietly, hiding the cold smile that crept up inside me. Yes, I was just an ordinary person. But at least I had a conscience. I didn't steal from others, and I didn't sabotage people behind their backs. No matter how good something looks, if it's stolen, it will never truly belong to you. And when the truth finally comes out, how embarrassing will that be? My words were subtle but sharp. I exposed everything without pointing fingers. But Sandy clearly felt guilty. Her reaction was instant and overblown. She stepped forward and grabbed me by the collar, narrowing her eyes. "What do you mean by that? Say it clearly." I gave her a half smile and slapped her hand away without flinching. "Did I say anything about you?" I asked, tilting my head. "Why are you so eager to take it personally? Unless you really did do something shameful." "Shut up," she snapped, clearly rattled. Her eyes darted nervously before she turned and ran, hands covering her ears. I calmly adjusted my clothes and let out a long breath. Scott stayed behind, glaring at me coldly. "Go ahead and be smug now, Lauren, but you'll lose everything soon enough. I'll watch it happen with my own eyes." With that, he turned and chased after Sandy. Watching them scramble away like clowns finally eased the frustration I'd been holding in for the past 2 weeks. Graduation was official after today, and I wasn't about to let them ruin my mood. I walked confidently into the auditorium, where my roommate had saved me a seat. The ceremony moved along smoothly. After the graduation portion, it was time for the student representative to give the speech. Maybe it was my earlier remarks that shook her, but Sandy was clearly off her game. She held her script in hand but stumbled through it, stuttering and mispronouncing words. I could clearly hear the whispers around me. Is this really the student representative? She can't even read a script properly. Did she not rehearse? Total waste of time. Wasn't she supposed to be a genius designer? What a joke. Sandy, realizing how bad it was going, glanced my way bitterly several times after she got off the stage. But really, she had no one to blame but herself. She was the one who embarrassed herself. After the ceremony, I took tons of photos with my roommates. Only once I was satisfied did I finally head home. In the following days, I received both my graduation certificate and my diploma without a hitch. I wrapped up everything on campus and moved on. Without Scott or Sandy buzzing around me anymore, I finally got a brief moment of peace. But that peace didn't last long. 2 months later, the results of the national design competition were announced. Just as expected, Sandy won first place. His older sister, Hazel, reached out to me again and asked when I planned to act. I had temporarily arranged for her to stay at my place. I remembered that around tomorrow, the renowned designer Claire Lee was expected to officially announce that Sandy would become her final apprentice. An old master suddenly taking on a student would instantly become headline news, and Sandy's popularity would skyrocket. That's why, of course, I planned to expose the truth at the very height of her fame. That's when it would be most satisfying. All right, Hazel said after hearing my plan. Then I'll wait a little longer. After being betrayed by the people closest to her, Hazel was already emotionally drained. She no longer held any affection for the sister who had stolen her work. When I first contacted Hazel, she had just been locked up by her parents, denied food and water, all because she refused to hand over her creations. Only then did I realize just how Sandy had managed to push things this far. It all stemmed from the extreme favoritism of their parents. Hazel had been working part-time since middle school, studying hard and earning her way into the country's top design university entirely on her own merit. But her parents didn't want her to keep studying. They forced her to drop out and get a job to support Sandy. Hazel refused and left home without a word. For 4 years, she cut off all contact with her family. But Sandy had her eye on Hazel's talent. She tricked her into coming back, stole her work, and even had the nerve to try and use Hazel as her personal ghost designer for life. Absolutely selfish. Sure enough, at 10 the next morning, Sandy was officially announced as Claire Lee's final apprentice. The news shot to the top of every trending list online. I stayed quiet until 8 p.m., waiting for the buzz to peak. Once it did, I gave Hazel the signal. She posted a voice recording on Weibo, along with a full set of evidence and a detailed explanation of her creative process. I also contacted several major influencers to help boost the exposure. Within just 1 hour, the scandal of rising star designer Sandy accused of plagiarism soared to the #1 trending topic. As expected, Hazel's phone blew up with calls from Sandy and their parents. I told her to block them all. Sandy must have been losing her mind right now, but the more panicked she became, the more likely she'd slip up. I was waiting for her to lash out. When she did, I'd be ready to deliver the final blow. By the next morning, the situation had reached its boiling point. Unable to get in touch with Hazel, Sandy was so desperate she went online herself, trying to defend herself. But against solid evidence, everything she said just made her look guiltier. Hazel and I stayed calm, knowing it was only a matter of time before Sandy came straight to us. "Lauren, get out here right now. How dare you team up with that piece of trash Hazel to ruin me?" Sandy had found my house. I wasn't surprised in the slightest. I strolled to the door, opened it slowly, and saw the group she'd brought with her standing outside. "You ungrateful girl." Sandy's mom shrieked the moment she saw Hazel beside me. "You're really going to hurt your own sister like this? Get online right now and clear Sandy's name. If you ruin her future, I'll never forgive you." But Hazel didn't flinch. She stepped forward and slapped Sandy's mom across the face, sending her stumbling back a few steps. "How did I hurt her?" Hazel said coldly. "All I did was tell the truth and take back what belongs to me. I'm not the same person you used to manipulate and control. I'm not going to clear her name, and I'm not letting this go. A plagiarist deserves consequences." Hazel caught her mother's hand as she tried to strike her again, her voice sharp as ice. "Try that again, and I'll break your hand." No one expected Hazel to stand up for herself like that. Her mother trembled in fury, her eyes blazing as she lunged again. I gave a subtle signal to the bodyguards nearby, and they instantly stepped in to restrain the whole group. "You used Hazel just to go after me and Sandy," Scott spat, his voice finally breaking the silence. "You're just jealous of Sandy's success. You're a venomous woman, Lauren. Hazel, don't let her manipulate you. Sandy is your real sister." So that's his game, turning me and Hazel against each other. Scott still thought I did all of this out of jealousy? That I wanted to ruin Sandy's success? "Scott," I said, my voice calm but sharp, "do you really think you and Sandy matter that much to me? The only reason I'm doing this is because I can't stand watching two thieves so easily steal the work and lives of others. Who do you think you are?" I let out a cold laugh and didn't bother replying further. At this point, none of them, Scott, Sandy, or her parents, had shown a shred of remorse. In their eyes, as long as they could benefit, even destroying someone else's life was justified. "Lauren," Sandy pleaded, her tone shifting to false sweetness, "I don't even have any real grudge against you. Why would you help Hazel go against me? Just give her to me now, and I'll let the past go." "Think of it as me owing you a favor," Sandy pleaded. "Whatever you want me to do in the future, I'll do it." Seeing that I remained completely unmoved, she finally realized that begging wouldn't work. Her expression darkened and she shot Hazel a vicious glare before turning to negotiate with me again. "Miss Lauren, my daughter Sandy is now the student of the legendary designer Claire Lee. As long as you hand Hazel over, we'll drop everything. We won't hold anything against you." Sandy's father quickly chimed in to support the offer. Hazel stood beside me, tense, clearly afraid I might waver under their pressure. But I didn't hesitate for a second. I simply gestured to the bodyguards behind me. "Throw them out." Before Sandy could finish another word, she was already being dragged away. The four of them were tossed out at the gates like stray dogs. Hazel looked at me, eyes filled with guilt. "Miss Lauren, my parents and Sandy, they're not going to let this go. If you keep helping me, they're going to come after you too." When I turned around, I saw her struggling with the words, torn and anxious. "What, you think I'm scared of them?" I said casually. "Don't worry, I made you a promise. I'll help you take back what's rightfully yours, and I always follow through. Besides, I'm not doing this for charity. You're my investment now. Just don't forget that we're partners." To me, those clowns outside weren't even worth a thought. "Miss Lauren, you have my word," Hazel said solemnly. "After everything you've done, you're basically my savior. I'll never turn my back on you." Unlike Sandy, Hazel's eyes held nothing but sincerity and gratitude. Finding someone like her was a lucky break. Because Hazel refused to clear Sandy's name, Sandy had run out of options. Even when faced with irrefutable proof, she still refused to admit she plagiarized. Instead, she took to the internet, painting herself as a victim, claiming that she and Scott had somehow offended me, and I was using Hazel to take revenge. Scott even went live on social media, ranting that I was some arrogant, evil capitalist while he was just a talented but oppressed underdog. They were trying to weaponize people's resentment toward the wealthy, hoping to redirect public attention from the plagiarism scandal. But I had anticipated their shamelessness. I told Hazel to report them to the police. No matter how sweetly they spun their lies, nothing beat legal intervention. Sandy never expected us to call the cops. She completely panicked and came to my house multiple times, trying to cause a scene, but she was always blocked at the door. Meanwhile, Hazel's former college classmates began stepping forward. She had always been known for her design talent on campus, and Sandy's competition piece, one that had taken Hazel a year and a half to complete, had such a distinctive personal style that anyone who knew Hazel could instantly recognize it. The tide of public opinion shifted completely. Within just a couple of days, the police released the results of their investigation. Every piece of evidence we submitted checked out. Sandy was officially found guilty of intellectual property theft. "I didn't steal anything. Why are you arresting me?" she screamed as she was dragged out of her house in handcuffs. "Hazel is my sister. I was just borrowing her work. That's not a crime." Hazel and I arrived at the scene just as the police were escorting her out. Even then, she refused to face reality. "Officer, you can't take my daughter," her mother wailed. "She's innocent. You should arrest that tramp Hazel. She's the one who deserves to suffer." Her father knelt down and begged, "Please, my daughter just graduated. You can't give her a criminal record." I glanced at Hazel and saw her face calm and unmoved. Only then did I relax. No matter how much Sandy's parents cried and screamed, she was taken away in the end. Hazel and I quietly slipped out of the crowd. From there, everything went smoothly. Sandy was sentenced to 3 years in prison for intellectual property theft. Her previous awards were stripped, and Claire Lee, of course, dropped her as an apprentice. Her reputation was utterly destroyed. But what surprised me was that some of our former classmates started exposing things online, like how Scott had cheated on me with Sandy during our relationship and how they'd tried to sabotage me during the outstanding graduate speech selection. Sandy was already behind bars, so no matter what people said, she wouldn't even hear it. But Scott, he wasn't so lucky. Scott was immediately doxxed by netizens and his reputation was completely ruined. When he saw the scandal surrounding Sandy spiral out of control, he quickly abandoned her, thinking he could escape unscathed. But instead, the backlash hit him even harder. Honestly, Scott was a real piece of work. He graduated from a proper university, yet instead of looking for a decent job, he spent all his time scheming how to live off others. At first, he pinned all his hopes on Sandy, hoping to ride her success, but once her so-called talent turned out to be a lie, he moved on to a new target, a senior student a few years ahead of us who had married the CEO of a public company. She was a bona fide rich woman. This time, Scott played it smart. He aimed straight for the money from the start. But in this world, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Because of the online backlash, his new relationship was quickly exposed. The rich woman's husband not only beat him up, but also took back every cent Scott had managed to scam from her. On top of that, he blacklisted Scott from the industry. Unable to survive in the city, Scott had no choice but to slink back to his hometown in disgrace. With him and all his nonsense finally out of the picture, my life returned to true peace. Hazel and I opened our own design studio. She handled the creative work, and I managed operations. Within just a year, our brand took off. I started traveling across the country for business. The last time I saw Scott was in Binhai City. I had been invited to attend a design forum, and that night, on my way back to the hotel, I ran into a drunk, disheveled man stumbling through the alley. "Lauren, is that you?" I froze at the sound of the familiar voice and turned around. The man in front of me was wearing filthy clothes, his long, unkempt hair partially covering his bloodshot eyes. But when he saw me, there was still the same bitterness and hatred in his expression. It took me a second to realize it was Scott. I quickly composed myself and smirked. "Scott, long time no see, so this is what you've become." I had known that someone like him, always trying to leech off others, wouldn't end up well. But even I didn't expect him to be this pathetic. "Happy now that you've seen me like this?" he spat. "Don't get too cocky. If my timing's right, your family's probably bankrupt by now too. My today is your tomorrow." He burst into hysterical laughter, completely oblivious to the fact that there wasn't a trace of downfall in my appearance. I looked at him with a cold, amused stare, completely unimpressed. "You think I'm like you? Getting a second chance and still depending on others? Pathetic. I've always known that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself." I lifted my chin proudly, eyeing him like he was beneath me. That struck a nerve. Scott lunged toward me in a sudden burst of rage, but my bodyguard stepped in just in time. "Back off," my guard barked. "Miss Lauren," another assistant rushed over. "Mr. Vrat Wong has arranged everything at the hotel. We'll take care of him. Please head back first." "Miss Lauren? You think you're some big shot now?" Scott screamed. "You'll always be that pathetic little bitch I used to beat down." But before he could say more, the 3 bodyguards behind me stepped in front, completely blocking him. Scott finally realized what was happening. His eyes darted down, scanning the designer labels I was wearing, disbelief written all over his face. He cursed under his breath, but no one paid him any attention. I glanced at my watch, saw it was nearly time, and calmly gave the guards a few instructions. before walking away without another word. That look in his eyes, I knew it too well. Scott tried to charge at me again, but my men beat him down and left him in the alley. I stayed in Binhai for 2 more days, and after the event ended, I returned home. Later, one of my people reported back that Scott had completely lost it after that night. He had gone mad, wandering the streets like a homeless lunatic, until he was eventually found by city workers and taken to a psychiatric hospital. I always knew someone like him would keep running from reality until the very end. In the end, he got exactly what he deserved.